now where the technology that we use doesn't really give us control. The money that we use doesn't really give us control. And so that's a big theme to what we're working on and why we started Foundation Devices, and kind of trying to build a hardware company that's the opposite of a lot of the existing companies out there like Apple and Google, where everything is very closed source, proprietary. You don't own any of it. So yeah, that's a little bit of the background as to why we wanted to work on Foundation Devices.
Gotcha. And I mean, why don't we kind of jump into like other kind of hardware devices? Like, why do you think this space needs an improvement, and what are you guys doing differently?
Yeah, so we really want to start with a hardware wallet because I've used like every hardware wallet. I actually a few years back, I was operating like do you remember Open Bazaar, that the
Yeah.
centralized like marketplace?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I had a store on there. I had Hodl Hardware Shop where I was like buying hardware wallets and reselling them on Open Bazaar, and like providing customer support and answering questions for that. I think that was in like 2016, maybe late 2015. And so I've always been really interested in hardware wallets, and then other different kinds of security setups like, Shamir secret sharing. I was using, Armory wallet back in the day before there were any real hardware wallets out with like, the different Shamir secret sharing shards printed on paper and so forth. So just always been interested in key storage, and how the best, how to best self custody your keys. But as I'm not a developer. I'm pretty technical, but I'm not a developer. And so I try to steer away from anything that requires like command line type solutions. And I've always been really into interfaces, right? And that's how most normal people interact with technology is through user interfaces of some kind, whether hardware interfaces or GUIs and software. And so I just have some personal gripes, right, with most of the hardware wallets in the market. I think that they're great for us more like early adopter Bitcoiners, like if you're more technical, or if you're willing to really learn a lot about how to like keep your seed phrase secure, for example. If you're willing to pass a micro SD card back and forth between your computer and your device in order to be more air gapped. But I'm just like, we've been super worried as a bull market approaches, and I hope that this is the beginning of a new bull market. We've been worried that we're going to have this large influx of new users, maybe like, millions, tens of millions of new users, over the coming couple of years. And then, of course, throughout this decade, hopefully hundreds of millions, if not billions. And we've just been looking at the products out there and thinking, what's a new user going to do when they come into the space? Are they going to use Coinbase or like, blockchain.com wallet, right? Which are both extremely popular. I know Coinbase has about 1 million Bitcoins right now in their custody, which is pretty mind blowing to me. Or are we going to allow these people to have better tools to self custody their coins, right? And in my view, and in our view as a company, the best way to self custody your coins for a normal person is a hardware wallet, because if you're using just like a laptop, you run into a lot of issues trying to properly secure that device, air gap that device. There's some fun tutorials like with Glacier Protocol, that you might be familiar with, where it's like, open up your laptop and remove the Wi-Fi card. It's like, okay, people aren't going to do that. And then with the existing hardware wallets, we're thinking, do they strike the right balance between design, ease of use, and security? And we didn't think so. We love Cold Card, for example, from a security model, but we're looking for something that's much easier to use, doesn't have as many options and even customizations, right, for a more normal user. And so that's why we decided to get in the game and launch Passport as our first product.
Awesome. And then I guess talking about Passport, can you kind of describe what the device looks like? I don't know if you have it with you, if you could show it on
So I
camera.
only I only have some crappy 3D prints, like I have because I have my 3D printer over here in my apartment.
Like a good
And
Bitcoiner.
exactly, I got my Form 3, over here doing well.
Nice,
And
nice.
yeah, and we're also, because of the lockdowns and everything, uh we don't have an office right now as a company. So as a hardware company, that means or a couple of my co-founders have like dev boards. So we're, doing the actual circuit board development and the firmware bring up and all that. And then I have a bunch of 3D prints and we're like mailing them around to each other and so forth. But basically, there's some great images of the device on our website at foundationdevices.com. But it's essentially about 4 inches long, 1.5 inches wide, and about 0.8 inches thin. So here's like an iPhone, the larger one. So it's pretty small actually. And I don't have the keypad in this model yet, but this is a good way to kind of see like the proportions of the device and what it looks like in the hand. Has a removable back cover as well, where the batteries are going to be inserted. And so the idea with this device is that, right now hardware wallets either like just have two buttons like Ledger, where for a new user, it might be difficult to figure out how to input like an 8-digit PIN number with two buttons, or even impossible to input like a passphrase, right? Like in plain text. And we also just want to be something that you just feel comfortable, like, picking up and just using and feels really comfortable in the hand. Where instead of having to like learn how to use the hardware wallet, you already know how to use the hardware wallet. It's like it's super clear how you navigate with it and how you scroll through the menus and how you enter numbers and text. And instead, you could focus all your energy on learning how to use Bitcoin. And I think that was one of our biggest gripes about hardware wallets, where it's like, hold on, first I have to learn how to use this device, and then I also have to learn how to use Bitcoin. So what's cool is we're going to do some really premium materials. So we're doing like a soft touch plastic, and we're doing this middle section is a zinc alloy that's plated in real copper. Not only does that, it just looks awesome and pretty badass, but it gives the device a good weight to it because like the core structure is metal instead of plastic. And I think there's just this elegance around like, copper that I really like. And we purposely have that showing through as a ring around the device and highlighting the camera and the micro SD slot.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely quite beautiful, and it has,
Thank
a
you.
very elegant look to it. Like you can even kind of tell that has the soft plastic from the photos. So those are really
Thank
nice.
you.
Um,
Yeah. Thank you.
yeah, so I was gonna say, I listened to your interview with Marty Bent a couple days ago. Fantastic
Mhm.
job. You guys really go into depth, like talking about, why Foundation and why build this hardware wallet. So for all the viewers out there, make sure to go check out that Tales from the Crypt episode with Zach. Um, but you guys put a lot of thought into every little component that you put into the device. Can you like
Yeah.
talk a little bit about those components, and just in particular, someone was tweeting at you in the announcement. I think this guy Crypto Kid saying like, "Oh, this looks like it does exactly what my DIY hardware wallet does." Can you kind of
Right.
compare and contrast and address that tweet?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So if you think about it, like what we're trying to do is pretty daunting in the sense that, open source software has been really prevalent for some time, but open source hardware is not very prevalent. It's very rare that you find any bit of hardware that's open source. And so if you start from like a first principles perspective and say, okay, we're building a hardware wallet, and we want it to be open source so that it's more auditable, it's more verifiable, it's easy for security researchers to know what's in the device, where we want to try to minimize the amount of trust that we need to have in the entire supply chain and suppliers. You have to kind of put like every component under the microscope. And so some great examples are like, okay, lithium ion battery. Almost every battery today has a chip inside of it that manages like the power, like the charging, right? So to make sure that it manages like the power cycling and so forth. That chip is put into the battery by the supplier, and it's running some kind of firmware, and you don't really know what it does. Um, and so if we wanted to put like a lithium ion battery in our device, then we probably don't want to put one in that has a chip like that inside of it. The screen is even a better example, where pretty much every screen nowadays, if you're getting like a nice high resolution display with like a good refresh rate, has an embedded processor in it that's also running firmware that comes from the manufacturer. So if you're buying, screens or batteries from OEMs in China, then you're likely getting stuff You're getting hardware, getting subcomponents that you don't fully know about. Like you don't exactly know how they operate. And it's the same thing with touch panels or touch screens, where they'll often have two types of chips. They'll have the chip for the screen and the chip for like the capacitive touch panel or layer over the display. And so we wanted to try to not use as many of those components that have their own chips inside of them as possible. So that's one of the reasons we're using AAA batteries, because we don't want to have to deal with any like lithium ion stuff with embedded processors. And it's similar to the reason why Cold Card did that cool cold power attachment for a 9-volt battery. It's like the same vein. But then what's cool too is that we're using a screen from Sharp that's made in Japan that's not only more power efficient, but it actually has no embedded processor. They basically etch like the circuitry directly into the glass around the display. And so we can visually inspect the screens at production and ensure that they have not been tampered with. And that's huge. And so if you think about it, like we have this entire stack of subcomponents, like the processor, the secure element, the screen, the keypad, the battery, and more. And we want to try to minimize the trust that we need in these suppliers so that we can validate these components ourselves, and that ultimately our end users who are savvy enough can also validate those components. And so it's a very long journey. Like if we wanted to be able to do a hardware wallet with a high resolution color touchscreen, there's no screen that we can buy right now. We'd have to like make one ourselves or work with a supplier that we would feel comfortable about.
And I think this is a good transition into something that, again, you talked about a lot on Marty's podcast. But like, what's the future vision for Foundation? It's not. I think the hardware wallet's just kind of step one.
Exactly. So our like long term, we believe that Bitcoin is going to reach some kind of mass adoption by the end of the decade, and I'm sure a lot of the listeners and you probably feel the same way. So if you kind of start with that premise that Bitcoin is going to have mass adoption, and you kind of work your way back, what does that mean for like the internet as a whole and all the devices we use? It means that pretty much every single internet connected device is going to have to store, receive, and send Bitcoin, right? Whether it's like Bitcoin or Bitcoin on the Lightning Network or something like that, which means every device essentially requires hardware wallet functionality. And so by starting with a hardware wallet, we can hopefully nail the basics, and we can make self-custody more accessible to like the new Bitcoiner or the everyday user as an alternative to something like using Coinbase or another custodial provider or exchange. But we want to work our way up the entire stack to phones and computers and more, over this decade. That looks probably something like, the hardware wallet, some kind of node, which I think is going to be really important to get normal people running their own nodes, which I know is a big topic these days. And there's some really cool software development happening on that front right now, but no cool hardware development that I've been aware of. And then working our way up to something like an open source, phone, maybe with an operating system that is based on Android like Graphene, or maybe with a new type of operating system completely, and hopefully being able to give people an alternative to this Apple Google duopoly that we have right now. If you think about it, Apple and Google, for completely different ways, because they have different business models, are everything they stand for is like antithetical to Bitcoin. Like Google makes all their money by trying to grab, monetize user data. And if we're moving to a world where we can give people ownership and sovereignty, then Google is not going to like that kind of world. And then Apple's approach is to kind of keep everyone in their walled garden ecosystem and grab a sliver of all transactions in that ecosystem, whether that's through the App Store or something else. And they're not going to like the world either, where people can have like sovereign hardware and run whatever applications they want and transact directly without, the App Store or anything like that. And so we're thinking like, if you take this long, like 10-year focus, you realize that both of these companies are going to miss this Bitcoin wave. And so it's like, maybe we could have a chance of kind of growing with Bitcoin and maybe ultimately getting to the point where we can offer a viable alternative to the stuff that these companies are building.
That's a pretty grand ambition, I have to say.
I
And
know.
I mean, and there is a
Yeah.
lot of work to get there. Just like you said, like it's
Hmm.
not a secret that open source hardware is just really not up to snuff. Like it's really, really difficult to build pretty much anything without using some sort of proprietary component in it.
It
So I
is.
mean that right there, like every single device that we are using right now,
Hmm.
like has issues, and Bitcoin kind of aligns incentives to figure that out. Like if your systems aren't hardened, like you could get people could attack you and freeze all your stuff and encrypt it and say, hey, you need to pay us in Bitcoin to get your
Right.
servers back. I think that goes all the way down to individuals' phones and stuff like that. So I think like
Hmm.
Bitcoin as an incentive to fix that is really going to drive just secure hardware and trusted hardware a lot further.
Yeah, and I think that's a perfect way to describe it. The Bitcoin fixes this, right? And I think, also another thing I like to say is that like normal people never cared about open source hardware, right? Like a normal person, mass consumers, they don't mind that their data is stored like with Facebook, right? They don't mind if their personal data is monetized or stolen, or it's just not a big deal, right? Because for most people today, at least in like the US or the developed world where they're not in repressive regimes, they don't have to worry as much about privacy. That will likely change over time. And I think the pendulum is starting to swing back towards privacy, but most people just don't care about open source hardware. And so there, like any company that wants to build open source hardware to date has targeted developers as their main market. So a good example is if you're familiar with like Purism, which makes the Librem laptops and phones. Great company. Um, I would argue that the products, I don't really think there's much product design going on over there, but they don't have to because that's not their target market. Finally, with Bitcoin and with getting people to store their own Bitcoin, right, have control over their own financial destinies and take responsibility for their own private keys, now all of a sudden we're going to need to get normal people using this secure hardware. And in order for the incentives to work out properly, the hardware has to be open source. So now all of a sudden we have an opportunity as like hardware makers to use open source in marketing, like be able to say don't buy that product because that product is not open source, and then hopefully we'll be able to sell a lot of these products that are open source, and we'll be able to reinvest that revenue into looking at the entire hardware stack. So maybe if we sell a lot of these hardware wallets, we can take a few $1 million and develop a color high resolution touchscreen that doesn't have any embedded processor. Or maybe we can work on an open source secure element chip to store the private keys. Or maybe we can take some money and spend it on developing a more trustable lithium ion battery. And right now, there's just like no incentive to do that stuff for normal hardware companies. And hopefully, Bitcoin will fix this.
What would be the first component that you tackle?
The secure element. Um, because right now, and what Cold Card did with their security architecture is incredibly clever. And we're using the exact same security architecture where they have a standard processor, and we have a standard processor that's actually running the firmware and the operating system. And then they're encrypting the private key or the master private key, and they're storing it encrypted on a secure element chip. And the chip, as opposed to being a more complex chip that runs code and runs like an operating system, which is what Ledger uses in some other companies, it's just like a dumb chip. And they're only using the key storage slot functionality. Like that's the only thing they're using, and what we're using too. And so we've been able to use this architecture that mitigates the trust that we need to place in this third party secure element chip. And we also have a data sheet. It's not a full data sheet, but it's a partial data sheet that's publicly available. Like that's not good enough. So I think that's probably the right place to start. But rather than making like a secure processor, which is something that Google and some other companies and groups are working on now, which is like a multi-year, very complex effort to figure out how to make like a secure open source processor that is capable of like running an operating system. We're talking about only making like an open source chip that can store a few private keys and maybe sign Bitcoin transactions. So I think that's the right place to start. I know Trezor has something in the works with their new subsidiary, Tropic Square, which is truly open source silicon, I think is what it stands for, or something like that. But they haven't released too many details. So, we're definitely curious about what they're working on. I think it's important. And if we have the ability to, we'll likely want to pursue a similar project. And one of my co-founders, Matt, who does all of our circuit engineering, all our circuit boards and that kind of thing, was actually at Intel for a few years working on semiconductors. So we do have the capability in-house to work on the chip side as well.
Cool. So you brought up Cold Card in this example as they're doing something very
Mm-hmm.
interesting, and I know that a lot of what you're doing was inspired by Cold Card. Can you kind of talk about like what's your impression of Cold Card in general, and how do you see Passport and Foundation kind of like working in an ecosystem with Cold Card?
Yeah, so I love Cold Card. It's the product that I use personally, and what I recommend to other people who I think are savvy enough to use it. Like I mentioned, I think their security architecture is really, really good and very practical with the use of this secure element chip and then the standard processor as well. And it's open source, right? The code is open source. The circuit schematics are open source, and that means there's actually no unknown code that's running on the device, which is like incredibly important. But it also, by using a secure element, uh, it makes the device very secure. So Kraken Security Labs, I think back in January, published a vulnerability on the previous generation Cold Card, um, which is long discontinued. They've been selling the Mark III, I think, for like a year now. And the vulnerability wasn't in Cold Card; it was in the chip that they used from the secure element vendor, and it was a multi-$100,000 attack, like a 200 plus $1,000 attack. Uh, and it required like they used a laser to like shave off layers of the chip. And so one mistake and they fried the chip. So it's not like an attack that you could execute with perfect success. So the fact that you could buy this device that's like 120 bucks or whatever it costs now and be secured from attacks that are in the multi-$100,000 range is amazing. And so we love their security architecture. And so that's why we're using the same architecture for Passport. Um, I think their product is more tailored towards more technical users and more early Bitcoiners that are comfortable with a lot of the terminology. Um, for example, when you go to export your XPub, it asks you, do you want to export to like, Electrum, Wasabi, Bitcoin Core? It'll ask you the address format to use and that kind of thing. And I think if you're the kind of a user that is comfortable with that terminology, then it's an amazing product. And it's extremely versatile and customizable and has a lot of really cool security features. But if you're a new user to Bitcoin, I think that can be daunting. But I also think that the security models offered by Ledger and Trezor are not the best. And I think we should be driving people to use the same security model as Cold Card. So the way I look at it is that if you're a more technical user or more hardcore Bitcoiner, you're probably going to buy a Cold Card. If you're a new Bitcoiner and you're not as comfortable with all the terminology, hopefully you'll want to buy a Passport. And then for any Bitcoiner that's in a multi-sig setup, I think this is where a lot of the magic happens because you could do a multi-sig setup, for example, with a Cold Card and Passport because we're also PSBT compatible. And then can mitigate a lot of risks with supply chain too, because you have like one that is made in Canada and then one that's made in the USA, and maybe you can augment that setup with other wallets as well, or like add your phone to the mix or something like that. And I think multi-sig is definitely a key. Uh, it's really important for the future, I think, of self custody.
Okay, so talking about multi-sig, you also mentioned nodes in the future. Want to kind of pivot to like what do you think is like the bare minimum to be running Bitcoin correctly? What is like the bare minimum setup? Like obviously,
Yeah,
the worst setup is like just using a custodial exchange, and then there's a gradient, kind of like how how if you're using a node, are you using multi-sig? If you're using multiple manufacturers
yeah.
of your hardware wallets, like at what point do you think like this is satisfactory for like the
Mhm.
average person? Like that's the steps they should be taking to secure their Bitcoin.
Yeah, I think for a normal user, let's fast forward like 5 years from now, new user to Bitcoin. I think the ideal setup is they're running a full node at home and they are using their phone as the way to interact with all this technology. So hardware wallets don't require use of a computer. You're using like your phone as the hub. And so ideally you would like quickly connect your node to your phone with like a QR code scan. And ideally that it would automatically just work with whatever wallet you're using and route all those transactions through your node at home over something like Tor. And then if you are storing more than a certain amount of Bitcoin, let's say more than a few $1,000s worth of Bitcoin, you'd be using a hardware wallet in some capacity, and you'd also be able to interact with that through your phone. So I think like the ideal Bitcoin wallet app, I don't think I've seen anyone make it yet. I think the ideal to me would be it's mobile first, and it essentially has like the idea of like a checking and savings account almost, because I think we need to kind of distill the language into something that normal people can understand, where maybe you have like your lightning wallet as like your hot wallet, and that's the equivalent of like your wallet, and then you have a colder storage that's in some kind of stored on a hardware wallet or something like that, and then maybe you have like a multi-sig setup, like essentially do layers of security. I think something like that could work really well.
Yeah, I mean that kind of makes sense, and it kind of reminds me a little bit about how Casa is going about it and thinking about,
Hmm.
um, you know, how you start with like a mobile app and then evolve into two of three, including your phone, and evolve to three of five, that kind of thing. But obviously, they use a lot of proprietary kind of services and stuff like that around like their multi-sig offering. Um, I guess.
And I would also say, by the way, that if you're not running a node, then of course you want to make sure you're connected over Tor, right? And so I think the prevalence of Tor, I think, is going to become really important over the coming years as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And in your answer, you kind of brought up this like before you even said hardware wallet, you said running your own node and connecting it to your phone. Like in the future, do you see running an? I feel like right now, the primacy it goes like get your Bitcoin on Coinbase or some other exchange, and then when you're comfortable enough, you take it off and put it onto a hardware wallet. And then if you become an experienced enough Bitcoiner, then you start running a full node. Do you see that kind of getting flipped on its head where it's like, you know, you start with running a full node before you even start with like an air gapped hardware wallet?
No, I don't think so. I just think we have to like. I think the way that people. It's really important to think about the way that people interact like with this technology. So I don't think we should think about it in terms of like you're pulling your coins off of Coinbase and you're putting them onto a hardware wallet. I think it should be that like you're using a mobile wallet that allows you to connect to a hardware wallet. And when you're sending a transaction, depending on which like wallet or account you're using in your phone wallet, you require different levels of authorizations, right? So I also think we have to get this idea out of people's head of that they're storing Bitcoin like physically on the hardware wallet. It's like, no, your hardware wallet is just essentially acting as a dumb signing device. And it's just another layer of approval when you're sending money around. So what I would really like us to be able to offer in the future is like maybe a kit that comes with a node and a hardware wallet that can really quickly pair together. I also think that nodes need to have hardware wallet functionality in them. I think right now it's like when you're using these Raspberry Pi nodes, I understand all the benefits of using a Raspberry Pi, right? It's like commonly available dev board. You could go buy one for like 35 bucks online or at your local store. There's already some good, it's easy to develop for. You can just plug in your external hard drive. But I think there's something to say about having like a node that has an integrated hardware wallet. And I believe there's some development going on right now. You might know more about this on the Lightning side of things, where it's going to be allow the Lightning keys to be stored on like a secure element or like a hardware security module, where you can actually make these Lightning nodes more secure and therefore be comfortable maybe with them storing more value on them. And so I feel like we need to get it into our heads that every device is going to need to be a hardware wallet. And then there's going to be different levels of security. You're going to have like your like offline air gapped hardware wallet. You're going to have your node that's always connected to the internet. Your phone already has a security chip in it. It's just right now it's a closed source chip. And so hopefully we'll be able to make products in the future that are open source. And then you have this assortment of signing devices with different kind of security protocols in place, depending on how much money you're spending. And if we can hide all that complexity from the user, and we can just make it where they know if they're sending $20,000, they need to grab their passport out of their drawer and they need to quickly scan a QR code back and forth to authenticate the transaction. Like, I think that's the way to go. And I mentioned on one of the podcasts previously that Apple has already made like normal people comfortable with the idea of authorizing like new devices from existing devices. It's like when you go set up your new iPhone, it'll ask you to approve it from, it'll like get this little pop up on all your other iCloud connected devices. And then you can approve it and you enter in like a 6-digit PIN code. And I think maybe we'll get to something like that with multi-sig for normal people, where you'll be able to cycle in or cycle out devices until your multi-sig setup. They'll have really clean, almost Apple level UX, but it's not going through any central server. And I think that's kind of the like the holy grail for getting normal people to do multi-sig custody.
Yeah, I mean, when people kind of like FUD this idea of normal people holding their own Bitcoin and get self custody and running their own
Yeah,
node, I feel like they don't take into account like the future improvements in the UX of doing that. And obviously, the way that you guys at Foundation are thinking about this, it's not just like how do we make a good hardware wallet, but how do we make a good hardware wallet that anyone who has reasonable technological literacy can manage, right? Someone who can use an iPhone
yeah,
and iCloud, they can jump on this thing and start using it within like an open source ecosystem.
yes. And I feel like, I mean, the arguments around UX to me are a little bit silly. Um, I look at it this way: what kind of future do you want to live in? Do you want Coinbase to store more than 1 million Bitcoin? Because that's the trajectory that we're headed on right now, right? We have custodial providers storing very large percentages of the total Bitcoin supply. I don't know what we're at now in terms of the total supply, and then also accounting for like coins that are lost. I think I saw it was like around like, was it like 18 million or something, or is that a few years ago? Like the total Bitcoin supply right now. Um, but if Coinbase has 1 million today, then that's like 5% maybe, let's say 5% roughly. Like, do we want custodial providers to have 25%, 50%? Like, where do you draw the line? And so if the goal is not to get all these newbies, like all these new Bitcoiners into using sovereign hardware that allows them to self-custody their Bitcoin, then they're going to Coinbase, or they're going to blockchain.com, or they're going to one of these other companies. And to us, that's like a future that is unacceptable, right? And so that's why we're so focused on trying to provide the best security while also aspiring to provide like Apple level type design. We're not going to get it right with this first product. We're going to try our best, and hopefully it'll be better than what's out there today. But, if we can keep working over the next few years, I think we can get there. And then the other cool thing about being a hardware company is that we don't have to actually build the software ourselves. Like, we just need to build hardware that is really nicely designed, that people want to buy because it looks good and because it's stable and it's great to interact with, and you can trust us as a company and you can trust our supply chain. But then we can kind of get out of the way and just make sure that developers have the ability to ship code on our hardware products, and we can take the best of what's out there and we can use that. And so I think it's to me, it's much harder as a software developer, because you're diving in and building this specific app, like you're building a specific wallet, and you're hoping that this wallet is better than the other wallets. Meanwhile, we as the hardware company, we just need to make sure that our hardware wallet is compatible with all the software wallets. And the way we do that is by supporting PSBT and micro SD card or QR code for data transmission. And so, yeah, I feel like it's our mission as a hardware company to be like as open as possible and stay away from these walled garden ecosystems. And that's one of the other reasons why we wanted to get a hardware wallet out there, because we didn't really like how Ledger has kind of created a more walled garden ecosystem with the App Store and a closed source firmware base, and Trezor is seemingly trying to push everyone through their centralized bridge, which is through their own web servers. And we're just thinking like, well, we want to do the opposite. Like, we don't want to operate any kind of centralized infrastructure, and we want to stay away from having to even deal with building the software wallets and that kind of thing. You want to try to really focus on just building the best open hardware platforms for the industry.
Yeah, and speaking about kind of new and cool sounding open hardware, I think like maybe 6 or 7 months ago, I was like pushing like, hey, the best way to get just average people with a Bitcoin node is packaging a Bitcoin node with other kind of internet based hardware that's in their house. Everyone has a router. Everyone has a modem.
Mm-hmm.
Someone needs to like
Mm-hmm.
package a node into that as well. There's also a
Yeah,
question asking about that, including the idea of a secure email server too. Like, what are your
yeah,
thoughts on just like personal computing and
definitely.
building out that kind of stuff at Foundation?
Definitely. And that's something that we think a lot about and we talk a lot about internally. And we're very closely following the different node OSs that are currently being developed. Um, there's the MyNode, obviously, and some of the others. And then there's that Nix Bitcoin, which is really interesting. And then there's that new one, Umbrel, which is gaining some early traction more on the UX side. So we're very focused on that, and looking at how we can best help and provide an alternative to the Raspberry Pi, with an open hardware design that we can package up properly and sell as like a fully packaged unit. If we want to give people sovereignty, they have to be running their own infrastructure. It's going to be a long journey, because we need to get everyone out of these centralized cloud services. We need to ideally get them running their own like mini home servers and being comfortable storing their own data and running things like email and file storage and sharing and other stuff like that at home. There's a couple companies that are approaching this right now that we're kind of have our eye on. Um, One is well outside of the Bitcoin space. There's a company called Helm, HELM, and they make like a personal email server that they've now added a VPN to, and then also file storage through Next by integrating with Nextcloud, which is a very popular like Dropbox, like self-hosted Dropbox alternative. The problem is that everything's closed source and proprietary, and they make you pay an annual subscription, with your credit card. And we think like that's the wrong approach because we're trying to give people sovereignty. We can't give people sovereignty by selling them like a annual subscription. Just like it doesn't work. Like the ideals don't make sense, and the incentive model doesn't make sense either. And then there's a cool one, Start9, which is in our space, which did a podcast. They were the first guest on Coin Center's new podcast a couple of weeks back. What they're doing looks really interesting, building what they call the embassy, which is like the idea is that it would run more than just a Bitcoin node, that it'll run other applications as well. But they're also just running that on Raspberry Pis. It doesn't have support for a hardware wallet or other features. So I think we definitely are going to get there. And I think the only way to do this is by building an open hardware platform, meaning that building a really nice hardware device that runs a really secure operating system, and then getting out of the way and opening up to developers for them to release applications for. There's already like hundreds, thousands of popular self-hosted applications. Like you go on, I think it's Reddit. There's a subreddit called Self-Hosted where they curate like a list of all the top self-hosted applications as alternatives to like email server and Dropbox and other things like that. But the problem is that none of these open source self-hosted applications have any distribution. There's no like, I think one of the things like Apple did best is creating the App Store, where you could just one-click install these applications on your iPhone. Or another great example is, Amazon with Kindle and allowing you to just one-click download ebooks to your device. I think in the hardware industry, it's very common to see like a lot of fragmentation. And then as soon as you kind of give developers or content creators like a clear way to release software or content onto a hardware device, then you see this ecosystem flourish. And so I think we're hoping to do the same thing. And I think we'll get there. And I think the way to do it, like you mentioned, is to do something with the router as well. I think that's the long term, especially if you want to add meshnet type stuff, which I think is one of the most exciting visions for the future.
Let's talk about meshnet routers, that kind of thing. Like, we don't need to end it with just the T's. Like, what's your thinking around that?
I don't think it's something that we'll do in the next like 12 to 18 months or anything like that. But I mean, if you just once again start from like a first principles perspective, like if you think Bitcoin is going to create a more efficient financial system, and you think like our existing systems with banks and credit card companies and intermediaries and governments and federal reserves and all that, if you think that's crazy, you think about how the internet works today, where if we were next door to right now, like if you were in the building next door to me in Boston, like across the street, when we're doing the stream, it's like we're going up to some central server somewhere and it's coming back down to you, as opposed to just us linking up directly, right? Or going through a couple hops through nearby routing nodes. And that's crazy. It's like the internet is so, I think, inefficiently built. And I think that we can make it a lot more efficient by allowing users to host basically what is like a meshnet node, and then allowing them to be incentivized to route traffic by being paid in Bitcoin. And so I know there's a couple cool groups or teams working on that. The Locha Mesh guys were on, I forgot which podcast they were on, but they did a podcast a couple of weeks back. I think that might have also been Tales from the Crypt. And they're working on some cool stuff there. And then I know GoTenna is doing some cool stuff with Lightning and mesh nets and incentivized, routing. And so the cool thing for us is that we don't actually have to build the software layer ourselves. We just need to follow what these other teams are doing and hopefully provide hardware that has the necessary antennas in it in order to make this a reality. And that's not just a physical node probably at home or like a router. That's also hopefully being able to integrate this into phones, and if we can pull that off, and if all of that can be incentivized with some like protocol that uses Lightning or Bitcoin in some capacity, I mean, that would be firstly so cool. And then secondly, I think it's just another source of passive income if you're operating, one of these nodes, or hopefully sparking like some kind of Bitcoin micropayments based economy, which is something that I'm also really excited about. So we definitely have our eyes on that, and I think the right way to make it happen is just to start building it into all of our hardware at some point, with the exception, of course, of hardware wallets that are air gapped.
Absolutely. I mean, it's just like thinking about like where we need to go to like creating the real peer-to-peer internet, rather
Yeah.
than maybe like the decentralized Web3, whatever that some of other people in crypto talk about.
Yeah.
It's a quite it's a long way to go, right? Like we have all
Hmm.
this infrastructure, and it pretty much all needs to get redone and and
Hmm.
opened up and made more trustworthy. So
Yeah.
unfortunately and fortunately, Bitcoin is kind of the incentive to do that, but it's
Yes.
definitely going to be a long and painful process getting there.
It's scary as hell, right? Because just like I was talking about from the hardware layer, I mean, literally every single component within a hardware device needs, maybe not every component, because like dumb components like built like a keypad with buttons or something is fine, but like chips and screens and cameras and touch panels and batteries, and like that alone is daunting, to think that everything inside of like a hardware wallet or phone or computer is going to really need to be re-engineered to be more open and trustable and verifiable. But then you start to think of it more as like the physical infrastructure, right? Whether that is your internet infrastructure, right, which right now is just a bunch of cables, right, that are running underground or above ground, that are going to like ISPs that are all centralized, or whether that's like the energy grid, or other things like that. I mean, we have the capability now, and I think we're going to have the incentives aligned because of Bitcoin to actually rebuild all this stuff over the next decade and beyond. And yeah, it's daunting as hell, because it's like where do you start, and how do you, like, as a company that's ambitious in the space and has the like ability to actually build some of this, like where do you start and stop, and where do you draw the line? Like, do you want to go all the way down to the semiconductors? Do you want to, what about the foundries that actually make the chips, because that is a whole nightmare of another problem, not just for open source reasons, but actually for geopolitical reasons, where you have only a couple companies in the world that can really manufacture cutting edge chips. And then what about the other direction with internet infrastructure and other things like that? And so we're going to need like a lot of companies to come in and make subcomponents and work on the infrastructure side, and then we're going to need software teams to build all the applications, and maybe some new protocols that are using Lightning or Bitcoin and other capacities to incentivize everything. And it's going to be like a crazy multi-decade journey, but uh, I think the incentives are there, and so we're super excited to hopefully contribute a little bit to that.
Awesome. Well, I have another tough question, and maybe we'll see if another one comes in. But one of the listeners is asking, what's your rationale around taking pre-orders on kind of like an unreleased, unproven
Mhm.
product? There's a pretty nasty history in Bitcoin around that, starting with like maybe the
Yeah.
Butterfly Labs, but that's not the only
Hmm.
one. Like, what do you think is
Yeah.
like the difference here, and what's your rationale around that?
Yeah. I mean, if we didn't do pre-orders, um, then we would have to raise a larger amount of like venture capital. And when you raise a larger amount of venture capital, um, sometimes it could skew the incentives, right? And so those are really the two options. We're not in a situation where we could go get like a loan to make this stuff, right? We're not going to be able to go to a traditional financial institution like a bank and say, "Hey, we're making a hardware wallet. Give us $1 million loan to fund inventory." And so our only options are to raise, $1 million+ or millions of dollars of venture capital, or it's to do some pre-orders and do some kind of crowdfunding type method. And I believe most or all of the hardware wallets today, like Trezor, Cold Card, were funded with pre-orders. There are some horror stories like Butterfly Labs on the mining side, and my team actually previously worked at a company called Obelisk, that did crowdfunding for ASIC mining hardware, and it was really tough. We actually crowdfunded over $26 million worth of mining hardware in summer 2017. I was like a new employee at the time at the company, like the first employee, and we hired a few people as well after that to work on that project. And we were ultimately a few months delayed, but we did ship all the hardware, which was over 12,000 units of mining hardware, all made in the USA. And so we left as employees to start this new company as founders, Foundation Devices. And so we as a team have a track record of shipping hardware in the space. And we have an existing supply chain that we've worked with before. And so we're using our existing connections and we're using this existing supply chain. And so we're hoping that, like, with our knowledge and experience of shipping like really complex hardware, which is, mining hardware is way more difficult, and really, really hard, like time crunches, because, with mining hardware, for every day that you're late, it's potential revenue that's lost for customers. We hope that will give some confidence. Additionally, over the next few weeks, we're going to be posting images and videos of where we are on the prototyping stage. So we're already on our second revision of development boards. And we're going to be placing an order probably in about a week or two for like a final revision of final prototypes. We already have all the 3D printing done for the enclosure. And we're going to be ordering like final, like, production quality finished enclosures as well as a prototype batch. We're pretty far along with the firmware, but there's still a lot of work to do on that side. And so we're going to be sharing all these updates with everyone over the coming months. If you pre-order the device, we're launching pre-orders in August, and we're aiming to ship by late December, so in time for the holidays. There's definitely some risk involved with that because supply chain issues or other issues that we might run into. So if you're not comfortable taking that risk, like, you're definitely more than welcome to wait for, at least for us to have like completely final prototypes in the market or early production units on the market or that kind of thing to feel more comfortable. But we hope that you're willing to kind of support us and pre-order a device, and allow us to have the funds needed to move forward with this first edition of 1,000 units, so that we can then make more of them, and then hopefully use that revenue and those profits to fund more and more complex devices, working our way up to phones and computers and more over the coming years.
Awesome. And before we close it out, why don't you just kind of give everyone just a quick shout on where they can find more information about
Yeah,
Foundation and where they can find you?
for sure. So we're at foundationdevices.com. We just launched a new website a couple days ago to coincide with the official launch of Passport. So check it out. We have information about Passport. We have specs. We have an FAQs page, and we also have a blog now with some good blog posts about our mission as a company, and like why open source is important for hardware, why U.S. manufacturing, and so on. We're also at Foundation DVCS on Twitter, and then I'm personally at Zach Herbert on Twitter, just one word. And feel free, to reserve a device. We'd be really appreciative. And then we'll update you over email as we progress with the development of the device and as we get closer to launching pre-orders next month.
Yeah, make sure to go on their website and put in your email address there for the updates. I did just earlier, and I am excited to get my hands on the first edition and unbox it for Bitcoin Magazine. So I
Thank you.
personally am
Yeah.
super stoked on that, and Foundation and built in the USA and open source and everything else that you guys are standing for and pushing.
Thank you. Yeah. And we're actually up to, I mean, the way we're doing it is, so we have a first edition of 1,000 units, and so we're kind of waiting till we get to like 1,000 emails or so, maybe a little bit more, and then we're going to switch it over to like a wait list, and then we'll basically open up pre-orders to the people who reserve it now, who reserve it first, and then kind of open up to the wait list, and then open up to the public. We're already at 670 reservations right now, so. Yeah, so if you're interested in getting on there before we get to 1,000, definitely go for it. And then, yeah, hopefully we'll be able to, bring everything to market on time. And we really hope that you guys like it when we do. And we'll definitely be sending you an early production device to test out and get your hands on.
Awesome. All right. Well, let's get these guys to 1,000 tonight.
I hope
All
so.
right,
Thank
Zach.
you.
Thanks again for coming on. Thanks for the time, and
My
thanks
pleasure.
for building such an awesome product. So excited for it. Cheers.
Thank you.